Between tariffs and tectonics, how the US Vietnam trade research reveals Asia's emerging power geometry. In international politics, the more consequential shifts rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They emerge quietly through technical adjustments, obscure clauses, or policy reversals that seem or mundane to casual observers but resonate loudly among those who understand power. The early July recalibration of the US on Vietnam imports is one such moment. On the surface, it looks like a trade compromise. In reality, it is a strategic signal flare illuminating the deeper reordering underway across Asia. The United States' decision to slash tariffs on Vietnamese goods from an extraordinary 46% to a still elevated 20% is not a simple rollback of an overly aggressive policy, nor it is a gesture of goodwill. It is a carefully calibrated maneuver, one that reveals Washington's evolving approach to China, its reassessment of Southeast Asia, and its growing reliance on economic instruments as tools of geopolitical containment. To understand why this matters, one must step back from the numbers and view the broader landscape in which they sit, from routine trade to strategic leverage. For much of the past 2 decades, US Vietnam trade relations followed relatively predictable trajectory. Such normalization in the 90s, tariffs were low. Since normalization in the 90s, tariffs were low, trade volumes climbed steadily, and Vietnam became an increasingly important link in global supply chains, especially in labor intensive manufacturing sectors such as textiles, electronics assembly, and light machinery. Vietnamese exports entered the US market with minimal friction, typically facing tariffs in the range of 3 to 4%. This arrangement suited both sides. American consumers benefited from low cost goods, US firms diversified sourcing beyond China, and Vietnam accelerated its export led development model. That equilibrium shattered abruptly in April when Washington announced a dramatic tariff hike, raising duties on Vietnamese imports to 46%. The magnitude of this increase stunned observers. Vietnam was not accused of currency manipulation, it was not a strategic adversary, and it had until recently been framed in Washington as a success story of supply chain diversity away from China. The timing was no less curious. The announcement coincided symbolically with Vietnam's Liberation Day, inviting speculation that the move was meant to send a political message rather than an economic imbalance. What message exactly was less clear? Shock as strategy. The April tariff shock was not designed to endure, it was designed to disrupt. By imposing a tariff rate so high as to be commercially prohibitive, the United States created a moment of strategic uncertainty, not only for Vietnamese exporters but for Chinese firms operating inside Vietnam, multinational corporations using Vietnam as manufacturing base, and policymakers in Hanoi attempting to read Washington's intent. Was this punishment or leverage, you may ask? The answer became clearer in early July when the US abruptly reversed course. The tariff rate was cut to 20%, still far higher than historical norms, but dramatically lower than the April peak. At the same time, Washington introduced a new and far more targeted measure, a 40% tariff on goods originated from third countries but routed through Vietnam. This was not a return to business as usual, this was a restructuring of incentives. The China question at the core. The real target of the new tariff architecture isn't Vietnam, it is China. Over the past several years, Chinese manufacturers have increasingly shifted portions of their production to Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, to bypass US tariffs imposed during the US China trade war. Goods manufactured or partially assembled in Vietnam could enter the US market under Vietnamese origin rules, effectively neutralizing Washington's tariff barriers. This new framework aims to close that loophole. By imposing a 40% duty on third country goods routed through Vietnam, the United States is attempting to choke of transshipment, a practice that has become central to China's adaptive trade strategy. Chinese firms operating within Vietnam now face a dilemma: accept higher tariffs, restructure supply chains more deeply, or absorb shrinking margins. Vietnam, meanwhile, is placed in a delicate position. It benefits enormously from Chinese capital and intermediate goods, yet risks becoming collateral damage in Washington's campaign to constrain Beijing. This is trade policy functioning as containment, quiet, technical, and plausible deniability. Vietnam's rising strategic value. That Washington is willing to engage in an economic brinkmanship underscores a broader reality. Vietnam's strategic importance has grown dramatically as US firms seek to de-risk from China without dismantling global production altogether. Vietnam has emerged as one of the most attractive alternatives. It provides political stability, a disciplined labor force, improving infrastructure, a government adept at navigating great power rivalry. In effect, Vietnam has become a hinge state, one whose alignment choices matter disproportionately to regional balance of power. But hinge states rarely submit to pressure without extracting concessions. The BRICS signal, just as Washington was tightening the trade screws, Hanoi sent a signal of its own. Vietnam's decision to join BRICS as a partner country under Brazil's 2025 presidency was not incidental. Though short of full membership, the designation grants Vietnam access to high-level forums alongside China, Russia, India, and other emerging powers. Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh attendance at the expanded BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro in early July was carefully staged image. Vietnam present engaged but uncommitted, neither fully inside the Western orbit nor subsumed within China's sphere. Hanoi is positioning itself as a beneficiary to multipolarity rather than a casualty of it. For Washington, this complicates his narrative. Vietnam is deepening trade with security cooperation with the US even as it reinforces ties with the global South. Institutions increasingly viewed as alternatives to Western-led framework. This is not fence-sitting, it is option building. Diplomacy in motion. The timing of the tariff recalibration also appears linked to diplomacy. Communist Party chief to Lam's anticipated visit to the White House later this month is more than ceremonial. It represents an ongoing effort to institutionalize US-Vietnam relations. Amid tensions rising in the South China Sea and intensifying US-China rivalry, yet beneath the handshake lies unease. For Vietnamese policymakers, the tariff whiplash, from ultra-raw punitive to partially reversed, raises questions about predictability. For American business, the 20% rate still represents a substantial cost increase, forcing recalculations across pricing and sourcing decisions. Neither side is fully satisfied. That perhaps is the point. Trade as a living instrument. What this episode ultimately reveals is the transformation of trade policy itself, no longer a static framework governed primarily by economic logic. Trade has become fluid, responsive to geopolitical shifts, domestic political pressures, and strategic anxieties. In this environment, tariffs are not endpoints, they are signals, they are levels, they are tests of alignment and resilience. The US-Vietnam trade reset is the best understood not as concluded deal, but as a waypoint in on ongoing negotiation, one shaped as much by Beijing's action as by bilateral considerations. Let's read the moment. Vietnam today occupies a precarious but powerful position. It is no longer merely a manufacturing destination, it is a strategic pivot in Asia's emerging order. A country whose decisions reverberate beyond its borders. For Washington, engaging Vietnam is no longer optional. For Hanoi, maintaining autonomy is no longer non-negotiable. The resulting dance, part cooperation, part coercion, will define not just bilateral trade, but the contours of power in Southeast Asia for years to come. In that sense, the tariff tells a story far larger than a percentage just suggest. They mark a moment when economic, strategy, and symbolism converge quietly, deliberately, with consequences that are still unfolding. In geopolitics, The most important developments often look technical until they don't.